So welcome to this panel. We have an author for an adult realistic fiction about new immigrants in New York City. We have a nonfiction of an education book on reality pedagogy for urban education revitalization. And we have a middle grade story author for children with magical powers and a farting dragon. Seem very different on the surface, right? We have three very different writers for different audiences. But as I read all the books by these three authors, I found each book actually fit quite snugly with today's theme, which is we're considering the concept of empathy. There's a lot of feedback on this mic.
Maybe move it lower, like on your...
Lower? I'm trying to figure it out.
On your lapel.
Okay, we'll see. Or maybe I'll speak a little less loud. So I'm offering a working definition here. It actually is really interesting. I work at the Dalton School, and this year our school's theme is empathy. So it fits really well. And I heard one of the definitions recently, and I thought it was something for us all to consider, which is you can definitely accept it or ponder it or challenge it. So to talk about empathy, empathy is not just that you understand how other people feel or how other people think or they might have an opinion. But empathy is also how you actually value other people's feelings. Not just understanding, but you actually think on the same level, like they're your peers. Just, there are a lot of marketing people who do research on, how other people feel, and they manipulate that, or they take advantage of that. But I think in education, what we want to do is how can we inspire empathy in our students, but also in ourselves to kind of empathize with our students. So your books all have a sense of being there with the others.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Maybe it was too loud. Is it better? Yeah, great.
Just in case.
Okay. Okay. So I found that your books present something about knowing that there is a huge capacity of agency of your audience, whether it's adults, children, or teachers. And we're not there to save anyone, but we're there to understand and encourage their own capacity to help themselves in a lot of ways, to be their own advocates. So my first question for all three of you, whoever wants to take it is fine, is how do you see your books, each book that ties with this concept of empathy, not just inspiring, but also understanding and respecting?
One of the things that I really wanted to do with the Inquisitor's Tale, one of the things I really wanted to do with the Inquisitor's Tale was to, in this book, not have any bad guys. There are no villains. In fact, it's also true of my first book, A Tale Dark and Grim. When we went through the process of trying to make A Tale Dark and Grim into a movie, which failed, but maybe resurrected, who knows. The problem that kept coming up was they kept saying, well, there's no bad guy. Who's the big bad? In a movie, you need a big bad. Who's their big bad? And we didn't have one. And that wasn't intentional in the first book, though I think it was important. And it was intentional in The Inquisitor's Tale. I was really, really trying to create characters who live their lives from their own perspective. So while it's about three magical children and their holy dog, and they are being pursued by knights, and they are pursued by monks, and ultimately they are pursued by the King of France and his mother, who near the sort of central event of the book is they burn 20,000 books of the Talmud in the center of Paris, which is a real historical event that King Louis IX, St. Louis, oversaw. That sounds like a bad guy move. But it was very important to me. I mean, King Louis is a saint and in the Catholic Church, and many people see him as one of the great kings in history. So to see the complexity of Louis, to have empathy with not only the good guys but the bad guys, was really important for me in trying to write this book. It was one of the central things I was trying to do.
So my book is about two families in New York City, a working class immigrant family and is it?
Should we just keep trying that one? Should we try that?
Great. Is that better? Is that better?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So it's about a working class immigrant family and a very wealthy family living on the Upper East Side. And I never really had a lot of empathy for the wealthy American family. I just didn't, you know. They're very rich, they have a nice house in the Hamptons, the kids go to the Dalton, you know, they're not exactly the people that I really feel led towards. So when I started writing this book, I had a lot of judgment towards this family, especially the wife. You know, she is Upper East Side socialite. She's very fragile emotionally. She's mostly materialistic. You know, and I didn't, you know, care much for her. And her husband works at Lehman Brothers. This is 2007 when the book starts. You know, he works at Lehman Brothers, so he's a Wall Street person. And if you read the early drafts, you could see that, you know, like, you know, oh, Imbolo, Mbue, you have issues. You know, you have a lot of issues towards, you know, rich people who you feel as if control too much of the world. So this book, writing it was a journey in empathy for me, you know, which is why I'm honored to be on this panel, because I did not say, oh my God, I have empathy, let me write it. It was, it was this journey where I had to look at these people and say, who are you to judge them, you know, and that it's not my place to judge them, it's my place to tell the story. And that if a reader decides that these are bad guys, that is up to the reader. If the reader decides they're good guys, it's up to the reader. But I wasn't about to write a story about, oh, look at these wonderful African immigrants, and look at these, you know, awful Wall Street people. And, you know, when, you know, my editor, Ivan Domhasfer, read the book, and he said, oh, what empathy. And I was very amazed, because I didn't think that, that it wasn't conscious. It wasn't conscious that, you know, I'm going to write an empathetic novel, but it was because I had to step back and look at the African immigrants. They're also very flawed, you know. But I could feel a lot for them because I come from their world, you know. I'm from West Africa. I'm mostly poor while I was writing this book. I'm black, I'm a woman, I'm an immigrant. I have a lot similar issues to them, so I could feel for them. But I didn't have a lot in common with this other family. So it was a matter of saying, what has that got to do with empathy, right? It shouldn't have anything to do with empathy. So in the process of writing this and in the process of learning that, yes, this Upper East Side socialite, she might be materialistic and vain and have a rich house, but she's like me. She's a mother, she's a New Yorker, she's a woman, and the Wall Street executive. So he might work at Lehman Brothers, and he might, you know, have been complicit in the recession, but I had more in common with them than I realized. So it was a long journey. It was a long journey of learning that for me, and in the end, you know, I was able to write this book. But the empathy did not come. You know, did not just. I'm not empathetic by nature. You know? I mean, I hope I am now, but I'm still working on it.
Well, you know what I think. What is fascinating about what you just described is this notion that you came to the work writing this thing that came off as empathetic, but it's a never-ending, ever-evolving process. And I think in my book, what I tried to sort of convey for the educator is that you don't understand other people, right? So by virtue of being in a world where we become educators, there's an established notion about why you came to this craft, right? You did it because you care, because you love young people, and you care about them. So it's almost like a baseline requirement of being an educator that you are naturally empathetic. And what I find problematic about that is that this natural sort of instinctive notion that we have constructed ourselves a certain way is very, very different from the reality. And it's much more troublesome to let somebody or to convince somebody who thinks that they're empathetic that they've got issues and they've got to do work. And so for me, the whole book sort of troubles this whole idea. You know, are opening up by talking about indigenous populations in the United States who we oftentimes feel as though, you know, they're just like in a backdrop somewhere, and say, no, these are folks who had awful realities, And those realities were actually put forth by schools and schooling under the guise of people who thought they were empathetic. Like, we're gonna educate the heck out of these indigenous populations and give them a better life because we care and we can see their perspective. So empathy actually sometimes becomes the driving force of doing violence on the student. And so so I open up with talking about the indigenous populations and start making connections between the indigenous and who I term the neo-indigenous, who are urban youth in schools, who are actually going through the same violence in schools today. And then I start playing with the idea of, well, you know, even teachers. Like, students view the teachers like we don't care about them at all. And so young people also have this notion of, like, they think they're being empathetic because, you know, they're interacting with the teacher in a way that they like, but it plays out differently. So what I tried to do is, like, just trouble the idea that we all think we know people. And then this is why the idea of reality pedagogy is like, well, what if for 1 second we suspend our notions that we know people and that we're empathetic, and that we have to also just understand the realities of people's experiences. And that the only fundamental way we can do this is giving folks a platform to be able to talk about themselves and talk about their lives without sort of any judgments. And so the book plays with empathy, but it's not an empathetic book. It's not a manual for empathy. It's really essential. What it really is like, you empathetic mother effers, you think you got it covered, and you don't, right? And you don't. And so don't hide under empathy. And then here are some approaches to instruction that we can use to be able to find out what the realities of all people are. So the realities of the white teacher who teaches in the hood, a lot of folks get stuck on that. The title is actually for white folks who teach in the hood and the rest of y'all too. So the rest of y'all too are folks of color who are teaching, who feel like that. And then for the students, and so to me, writing it was about laying out this sort of like framework through story and narrative and strategies and tips, et cetera, for understanding that we all lack empathy and that we all have to do work to ensure that we understand that process more to be more effective in whatever roles we have in schooling.
Yeah, thank
Amen.
you. And
It sounds like I'm the only empathetic one up here, though. I mean, you're against it. You admitted you're not already, so.
yeah,
We still love you though.
Okay, yeah. I'm just blinding myself, obviously. as Chris
and
is
I was
saying.
encouraging the three of them to talk to each other, but you're going a little fast on that part.
Sorry.
But I want to respond to what Chris was saying. Is, you know, I do work in an independent school, Upper East Side, pretty high power school, not quite people consider in the hood. But I also felt like when I was reading your book, it definitely opened my eyes, and I can kind of apply a lot of the philosophies, ideas, maybe not taking the entire 7 aspects, 7 C's into my classroom every day, but there are a lot of things I can use. And one of the things I found interesting is your concept of kind of a hero complex or savior complex. And I feel like all 3 of your books have kind of either a notion of that or characters that think that they're here for the good of others, but they do it in a way that suits them, that suits the others. I wonder if you want to just take that and talk about it, and you can ask each other questions. They all read each other's books, which is great. So they can have a conversation. Yeah.
Imbolo, do you want to?
No.
No? Okay.
I didn't finish the book. So.
That's okay. The ending's the best part. You're really going to get to it.
You'll find empathy at the very end.
I think what's fascinating about Roxanne said, and I think I was very challenged by Chris's book, and I think we have all been, and certainly I have continually been challenged, especially over the last couple of years, with the We Need Diverse movement, books movement, with Black Lives Matter. There's a lot of wonderful conversations going on that are wonderful because they are challenging. And I think I have been uncomfortable often. And I think I'm trying to learn that discomfort is not a bad thing, but rather a necessary step in this, or maybe not even a step, but like a long-term state that I'm going to have to embrace. There are a lot of do-gooders in the Inquisitor's tale. So King Louis, who's burning the books, before he burns the books, he says to the Jews who are assembled in front of this burning, and this is all a historical thing that happened, he says, I will pay you if you will convert to Christianity and follow Jesus. It will save your soul. It is good for you, and I will give you money to do it. Louis really believes he's being a good guy. And if someone were to turn to him and say, you are lacking in empathy, or you are being, persecuting or discriminatory, he was shocked. And I think that sense of shock and discomfort, I grew up more like the Upper East Siders in your book than the African immigrants, though, in Baltimore. And so that kind of discomfort has been pervasive for me for the last few years, and I think probably really helpful.
One thing that I always say, and I sort of allude to it throughout the book, but don't say it explicitly because I want folks to be able to sort of figure it out on their own, is that if one constructs self to be hero, then one constructs other to be villain. And so while there's comfort in the construction of self as hero, and that it feeds the self, it feeds the ego, it feeds the aspect of self that is good, it also means then that you have to sort of perceive somebody else as having lack of value in some way. And when we talk about schooling and teaching and learning, when you construct yourself as a hero to save young people and you position them as villain, then you are reading them through the lens of villain. So now you're reading their norms as problematic, right? So now rather than say, oh, that child is out of their seat and is excited, because you're there to save the child, you say, well, that child is out of their seat and needs me to control their behavior better, right? So it's and so that thing, that hero-villain narrative is something I try to play out. I try to play it out historically. I try to play it out in like my personal narratives, and I also try to play it out and trouble it like from a perspective of self. So in the book, I write a lot about how awful I was at certain moments as a teacher. Because I had and I write about this also in the book. This idea of like you make your way out of the hood is like this sort of pervasive narrative for folks of color. So I grew up in urban America. I went and got a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a doctorate. So I beat the stats. So now I've beat the stats. I'm gonna go and give back to the lowly, who look just like me. And so I went into schools with folks who look like me from the same neighborhood. Like, I'm gonna make y'all better, so you can have the same experience as I did. And then I was confronted with the fact that I had married myself to notions that were from the institutions that I said I was challenging. Because by virtue of being successful within institutions that create power dynamics, we ourselves become and perceive ourselves to be power wielders. And so I was doing that same work that the teachers I hated were doing, right? Because I had sort of constructed self as hero. And so I write about all these narratives where I had to trouble that, like where I was awful with young people, where a young person was telling a story and the teacher saw it one way. The teacher was like, you're gonna get, I'm suspending you because you're always sitting at the door, you're always talking to your friends, and you're getting on my nerves. And then we're in the principal's office and the teacher's saying this narrative and the young woman is like, livid, like she's almost crying, she's in tears, she's like, she's lying. I'm like, there's no way this girl can be like this emotional if the teacher was not telling the truth. And in reality, they both had the same experience. She was standing at the door, she was talking to her friends, and she didn't have the materials. But for her, she was like, I was sitting at the door because I wanted to say what up to my friends, and I was prepared for class because if I ever need a paper or a pen, I can ask my homegirl. Right? And and I'm the one who's bringing energy and light to the class because everybody else is bored. And the teacher's reading the exact same scenario, like this is a young person who's getting in the way, and she's reading it as I'm trying to help you out and you don't feel me. But because the teacher's viewing her as villain, it plays out in a way where she gets demonized. And here's where the hero-villain thing becomes problematic because it's always bisected by power. Right? So if we all have multiple perspectives and everybody can have a voice, we're good. Right? But if we have multiple perspectives and I see you as villain, but I have the power and I feel like I'm a hero, then I can consistently quelch you and you lack voice completely. Like you never have an opportunity. And so I play out the hero-villain thing. I'm sorry, I talk a lot. I play out the hero-villain thing, but I also play out like how do you then have strategies to help you sort of overcome your positionality to be able to see the realities of the other.
There's actually something that you said that I see playing out in your book when there's a conflict in the middle of the book between the Upper East Side family and the Jende, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and his wife, right? When about the prostitutes. I don't want to give away too much, right? And he.
Give away too much. You just said prostitutes.
I give it away. You should read the book. And but because they have power, and the African immigrants don't have power. Mm-hmm. The white family's perception of the situation of the same facts becomes privilege, right? He loses his job and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think I struggle with that hero-villain thing because in the beginning I thought, well, the African immigrants have to be the more noble people, right? They came here, they're poor, trying to have this better life, and the wealthy guy who works at Lehman Brothers, he's probably going to be the villain. But through my journey of empathy, I started realizing that he has his own perspective, right? He has his own, struggles and baggage and everything else that I did not really consider. And all I saw was this man who has power, and like Adam said, there's a lot of power dynamics. Who has power? And at one point, the African family has more power over the white family. And I started thinking that there really is no hero here. That maybe there isn't. I didn't think that the reviewer said that. Like, oh, there's no hero in this book. But I think it makes sense that to what you're saying, Chris, that once you start looking at people through that lens and saying, oh, I can help you, I can save you, instead of seeing them and what they have and what they're trying to offer, it creates the struggle. And for me, as a writer, I was able to step back and say, don't try to be a savior or anything. Just tell the story. Just look at them. Just look at who these people are. Look at their struggles and just tell the story, and don't try to put your own, agenda or whatever it is into it.
You know what I love that you did also is like how power becomes. It's either money that provides it, or when there's a shift, it's information.
Yes.
Right? And it becomes knowledge, and you play that out so beautifully. It's like, okay, because when we think about power, we always think about class and money. And so the person who has class and money has all the power. And then when there's that reversal, it's just the most beautiful thing ever, which I think can happen in classrooms, right? Where the young people can have the opportunity to sort of challenge the power dynamics and sort of control their own learning experiences and sort of informing the educator. And again, this is why they have us together, because I think like what happens in your story, where there's that shift, is exactly what I'm advocating for in classrooms. That there is some sort of a shift where we start seeing the students as having the power.
Yeah, and also I think we talk about hero and villain. Do we want to talk about victims?
Well, that was interesting when you were describing the savior, the hero-villain complex. That so often it feels like, I did small stints in schools that were, underprivileged or whatever you want to say, and often it was coming in as a hero to save people. But it's true, then the victim becomes the villain very quickly as soon as there's any oppositional behavior. I came in here to do good, and you're not helping me do good. Therefore, you were a victim. Now you're the villain.
Yes.
I didn't get your question.
Yes. I really want to sit there and not here, because I feel like you're all having a great a conversation. And, but I have something for Imbolo. Okay, I'm trying to pronounce it correctly, not very well. There's a lot of talk on writers writing from inside or from outside, right? And as you all know, if you create fiction, there's no way to only write from inside, because you have to, cast a very rounded, group of people. Some of them are one way, the others are differently, right? So you're an insider when you talk about the Cameroonian family, much more, like you said earlier. So, and you talk a little bit about your journey to empathy to write the other characters. Can you tell a little bit more about how you portray an Upper East Side white family whose children actually go to the Dalton School? She didn't just mention it, it's actually in the book. The kids are actually going to the Dalton School. So it was funny because she was like, oh my God, she is going to moderate my panel. And so what did you do? Like when you say you discover, how did that empathy come to be?
Well, so I was, just a little background, right? So one day I went for a walk. I was unemployed. This is 2011, and I noticed chauffeurs waiting in front of the Time Warner building in Manhattan. And that is why I got this idea to write this novel, because I was very intrigued by the idea of people who have chauffeurs. And what is the relationship like between the chauffeurs and the families they work for? And I come from a town where a few people had chauffeurs. I was raised in a town called Limbe, Cameroon, and some people had chauffeurs there. And it was very wealthy people, but it wasn't that rare. But when I was in America, I'd never met anybody who had a chauffeur. So when I saw those chauffeurs and the executives, I thought, my gosh, this is very interesting. What is it like to have a chauffeur? I mean, I would love to have a chauffeur, but so what is it like, to have somebody driving you around? So my first idea was to write about, these two very different families, working class immigrant, wealthy American family. And I was thinking more about the relationship between the executive and Lehman Brothers, who is the father in this family, and the chauffeur, who is the immigrant husband. And you know, I went by a lot of people that I'd met in New York City, which is what helped me, you know, because, you know, living in New York City, I have friends who know people like that, and they told me stories. And yes, so that judgment I started writing with came from that, you know, from saying, oh, I know so-and-so, and they're so snooty, or I know so-and-so, and they, I don't know, they have a house in the Hamptons, and they go to St. Bart's for vacation. You know, it was all these things that you hear that are very stereotypical of people in that world. And there wasn't much more to it, like, oh, this woman came from this background and she worked really hard and now she lives in the Upper East Side. Or this man, you know, he worked so hard at Wall Street to take care of his family. Or, you know, like, there wasn't so much more there. So when I started writing, I was going by all these, you know, stories that I've been told about these people and how, you know, they are, and they wear their Versace, and they, you know, they fly, you know, first class and all that stuff, you know. And then, you know, and then when I write about the African immigrants, it's like, oh, African immigrant comes here, working hard, living in Harlem, working for jobs, you know. So people who read the elevations, they said, my gosh, this is not right, you know, like, why do you care so much about the African immigrants? You know, I said, because they're like me, you know, of course I'm going to care about them. Right. But I wanted to write about these two families. It was two families I cared about. And so while writing, you know, this journey of going and saying, okay, so this guy works at Lehman Brothers, and I would have loved to work at Lehman Brothers, you know. I would have. I dreamt of working on Wall Street. So I have so much more in common with him than I realized, because I didn't want to work on Wall Street because I wanted to work on Wall Street, but because of the money, you know. I wanted to make that kind of money because I am an immigrant. I came here and I wanted to have a certain lifestyle of financial comfort. And I didn't get a job. You know, nobody would hire me on Wall Street. But if they would have hired me, I would have probably stayed there and become a guy like the guy in my book. I would have probably had a house in the Upper East Side, you know, and had a house in the Hamptons. But instead, I was unemployed. So I started thinking about him and saying, he reminds me of myself. And his wife, who was raised in poverty. And I wasn't raised in that kind of poverty. I was raised in a nice, regular African family, you know. I mean, America in my city was poor, but it was very standard kind of lifestyle in my culture. But I can understand her shame, you know, that she was born in poverty and she was raised in poverty. So I started looking at them, and instead of thinking that these people are nothing like me, I started seeing myself, you know. I looked at them and I saw myself. I saw somebody who got a Wall Street job that I would have loved to get, a woman who came from poverty, like I probably understand, because I lived in America. I wasn't poor in Cameroon, but I was poor in America. I mean, like, you know, like, it was a very, very brutal kind of poverty when you have $10 to last you for 2 weeks, you know, that kind of poverty. So I started to understand the shame of that, you know, and how she felt. And all of a sudden, she wasn't just this rich woman on the Upper East Side. She was like me, you know. She was another version of me.
Yeah, thank you. And Adam,
yeah,
you were writing about kids and people in the medieval 1242. So there is no way for you to really felt like you lived then and there and can be kind of part of the insider.
Right.
So what was the insider-outsider scenario?
I think it's very interesting to hear, Imbolo, your description of choosing elements of your personality to identify. I think that's really useful. I tried to do some of the same thing. So on the one hand, I needed to acknowledge that the wonderful author Rita Williams Garcia, who you guys probably know, I once heard her say that if you're writing a character, no matter what they're like inside, you have to acknowledge how they live in their own skin, that they cannot help but live in their own skin in the world. And so there is a Jewish boy, and I'm a Jewish boy, and so I was able to, you know, easily slip myself into sort of the feeling of being a scared Jewish boy in a world of big people, because I've been that, even, you know, I wasn't scared because I was Jewish. But then, you know, there's a young monk whose mother is a North African Muslim woman, and I've never looked like that in a world where everybody else was white. But he is a kid who can't stop talking, who's got a lot of ideas and gets in trouble all the time in his schooling. Well, that is me. I did that all the time. Though, Chris, you probably talk more than I do, which is really impressive. I would have wished we could have gone to school together so you could have gone to the principal's office more than I did. It would have been the only one. And Jean, this peasant girl, feels misunderstood and afraid. And so I took elements of their personalities. I tried to, put myself in their heads and see the world through their eyes, but I had to keep reminding myself of what their skin was like, what the village they lived in was like, what people thought of them around them. Peasant girls would have been probably the most reviled and discriminated against person in the Middle Ages by the upper classes because they were seen as lascivious and stupid and worthless and barely human. And so I could identify with Jean's personality, but I needed to put that personality in the context of how the people around her saw her. So trying to simultaneously slip myself into their heads and live in their skin was the approach I took.
And then you talk about lived, right? In your book, you talk about lived in the space. So can you elaborate a little bit? Do we have to always live like somebody else to have that understanding?
Yeah, we don't have to, right? So we don't have to live in someone's space to understand them. We can take the strategies that you both use, which is sort of identifying pieces of ourselves that connect to the other and sort of develop some empathy out of that. But I do make the argument that if you really want to get it done, you should, right? There's nothing more powerful for me to be able to understand the experiences of the other than to fully, not psychologically, not intellectually, not academically, not as an author, but physically put myself into the spaces where they are to try to get some understanding of their experiences. I think, when we talk about a historical narrative, it's of course more challenging, right? Like, there's no time machine.
That you know about.
Yeah, so we look,
Yeah, you did. You're like, right.
But from my perspective as a person who's writing for educators or for folks who are interested in education, and people pontificate, brilliantly about the nature of urban education and young folks of color, the nature of how these hoods are so challenging and whatever else it is. And I'm like, yeah, that's true, but it's 20 minutes away. Like, you could get on a train and go. And so if you're that concerned, like if you're that worried and you're that, idealistic, then get an apartment in the hood. And so in the book, I write about that. I don't say do it if you don't, like if you're scared to, you should do it anyway. But I mean, if you feel like it's an issue, don't do it. However, I feel like if we can bring ourselves to the point where we can sort of like talk about how much we care about the other, and we have the access, the privilege, and resources to be able to do so, then we're really just playing this game if we don't. In working in education, like folks who come into to teach in urban spaces, you can get from a program your master's degree paid for, your books paid for, and a certain stipend on top of your salary if you choose to work in a certain space. So you can't tell me that there's no resources to give you a housing stipend to live in a neighborhood where your school is. Right? The resources exist for us to be able to do that. There is a collective unwillingness to recognize that, to fully understand one's experiences. You should do that. So I make the argument you are a much better educator if you work and live within the space where your school is. Because one, you understand the context, the neighborhood, the environment, the experiences, but you're also visible. And visibility matters. Because young people think teachers appear when they sprinkle the fairy dust and emerge out of the basement. And if you walk down the hallway in your hood and go to the supermarket and you see your teacher in the hallway, it's a very, very different relationship that you develop with the teacher, and there's a very different relationship that the teacher develops with the student. And so I make the argument that if that's such a reality, then it should be present in our teacher preparation. It should be present in the work we do. We should. So I write in the book about tours, and not like a hood tour, not like a look how exotic they are in their own element kind of way, but in a way of like, if you're gonna teach somewhere, know the neighborhood, go to the barbershop. So I write about Pentecostal pedagogy and barbershop pedagogy, like the things you learn in these spaces where folks gather that can inform your practice, and that teachers can add that to their. Swidler talks about the cultural toolkit. You can add that to your cultural toolkit to make you a teacher that can access more when you're working with young people.
Yeah, and then we're actually going to. We don't have a lot of time left, so we're actually going to talk about teaching empathy because that is the title of this panel. So I kind of threw the monkey wrench to O3 in an email recently. I said, like, is empathy teachable? Can you actually teach empathy? If so, how? This is it's a big question that I don't know that everybody has answers. So take it away.
I'll start and I'll just let y'all rock, right? Frantz Fanon has this amazing quote, and the quote is, anything can be taught to the people under the single condition that you want them to understand. And I feel like anything can be taught. And I'm not saying that that quote also means that there's, it's sort of, to me, it's a sidebar that says you don't reach to a point, right? But anything can be taught. The skill set to be able to develop your own empathy and practice it over time, become better at that thing, can be taught. And so in the book, I write about what I call reality pedagogy, which essentially is strategies to help educators to be able to understand the experiences of young people and use that to inform their practice. And I feel like those C's are things like cogenerative dialogue, conversations with young people on a regular enough basis to understand what their realities are. Co-teaching, giving teachers the students the ability to be able to teach the class and then teach the teachers about their lives in a structured format. Cosmopolitanism, giving young people roles in the classroom that go beyond the role of sort of passive learner to be more of an active participant in the socio-emotional landscape of the classroom. I would go through the other C's, but I want you to read the book. But these are all strategies that you can implement to help you to sort of develop your wherewithalness around understanding the experiences of other people.
Yeah. For example, when you say you can give a student in the classroom a job of being the social emotional counselor for other students in the same classroom, I found that really enlightening. How about you? You feel, because you talk to a lot of kids, and you've taught kindergarten, first grade, second grade, fifth grade, ninth grade, right? So what do you think?
It's interesting. I mean, I think certainly literature is one way to, there have been a million studies that show, right, the more kids read, the more empathic they are. And I think we probably all know that. And certainly reading novels is a great way to live in other people's skins. I think that that's one way that I learned empathy to the extent that I know it, which I now admit I don't, apparently. None of us do, right? Or if I do, it's problematic. But I think that the way that I really I got out of my own skin as a young person was when I was in middle school, I started getting in a lot of trouble. And it got to the point, I guess it was in 8th grade, when I was running with a group of kids and we started doing bad stuff, breaking into cars and committing crimes. And when my parents finally caught me, there were many things I had to do to sort of make up for what I did. And one was I had to do some kind of charitable work. And I chose working with kids. I'll shut up in 1 second. And I worked I started at a place called Emdin Family Center. Emdin is a white working class neighborhood right next to where I grew up in Baltimore. And I had a group of kids, and I was going to do a drama class because I liked acting. I didn't know anything about it. And these kids, I asked them what they wanted to do. And they wanted to do a musical of The Little Mermaid, Disney's The Little Mermaid. And all I remember is that they were like, these kids, I had never seen kids who, were as dirty and poorly behaved and enthusiastic as these kids were. They didn't look like they ever showered, and it didn't look like they ever needed to, because they were just living this beautiful thing in this little space. We played Look at This Stuff, Isn't That Neat? What is that song? Part of Your World. And I just remember them dancing, boys and girls, around this space, throwing up their arms and thinking, this is a place that I want to be, and these are the kids I want to learn from. And so I've worked with kids since then, since that day. I don't think anyone taught me empathy. I think I just had to be with those kids, and I developed a little bit of it just by letting them rub off on me, letting them teach me what we needed to do.
Powerful.
Yeah. Well, I think I want to take a class with these guys,
Yeah.
I think I still have a lot to learn about empathy, and I think writing, like I said, is a big way for me to learn. Living in New York City also, only because you're surrounded by people who are so different that you're very curious about them. At least I am curious about them. I don't know. I'm a big fan of the TV show Game of Thrones, and there's a character they used to say, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." And I always think that I meet somebody and I say, "You know nothing about them," and I know nothing, right? I don't know anything, and I think that is where my empathy starts from, this awareness that what do you know about this person, about this situation, and that it's like Chris said and like Adam said, that it's just a journey of always being open to discovering. And I really, really hope that I can work on my empathy and be more empathetic, because
you read the book, it's clear she's very empathetic.
I do. I think, thank you. But I also realize now that, you see, it works in the book, right? But in real life, I'm like, oh God, I need to be more empathetic, So I think, that as a writer, I think I'm there, but as a person in real life, I'm still working on it.
So we all.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom with us
Thank you, Roxanne.
and being so lively and humorous